One cold October night, a 20-year-old college student walking home from an off-campus study group vanished along a quiet residential stretch just minutes from her dorm. Police proposed the simplest theory: she must have run away, yet nothing supported it. No packed bags, no suspicious messages, no financial activity. And then a full year passed, with no trace, no sightings, no clues. Until a city sewer maintenance crew entered a storm tunnel for routine cleaning and found a single object wedged deep inside the darkness. An object that should never have been there, and it changed the entire investigation. The night she disappeared began like any other, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of night that should have ended with nothing more dramatic than a late walk back to a college dorm. But as the fog rolled in across the old brick campus and the street lamps flickered against the cold, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but enough that a few students later recalled a strange heaviness in the atmosphere, like the campus itself was holding its breath. She had stayed late at the study group, pushing through the final pages of her psychology notes while her friends drifted out one by one. "You sure you don't want a ride?" her friend Maya had asked, pulling on her jacket. The young woman smiled, brushing it off. "It's a 10-minute walk. I need the air anyway." And that was true. Midterms were crushing her. A quiet walk sounded perfect, freeing even. By 10:47 p.m., she gathered her books, slung her bag across her shoulder, and stepped outside. The cold bit instantly at her face, numbing her cheeks as she crossed the quad. She tucked her chin into her scarf and headed toward Brookline Street, her usual route. Leaves scraped across the sidewalk in brittle spirals. A lone car passed, its headlights carving brief tunnels through the fog. Otherwise, she was alone. Campus security cameras captured her exiting the library courtyard, walking with her usual brisk but relaxed gait. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't texting. She wasn't afraid. But something about the footage becomes haunting in hindsight, because she is the picture of someone who has no idea she is living the final recorded moments of her life. Just before 11 p.m., she texted Maya, "Made it halfway. See you tomorrow." It would be the last message she ever sent. Brookline Street was quiet, almost too quiet. Most students avoided it after dark, not because it was dangerous, but because it was isolated, lined with narrow sidewalks and old sycamore trees whose branches created long, distorted shadows. Beyond them ran a series of storm drains, ancient pieces of city infrastructure older than most buildings on campus. As she walked, she hummed softly to herself, the sound of her boots tapping against the pavement, blending with the faint gurgle of water flowing beneath the storm grates. She didn't notice the way the fog thickened behind her, swallowing the halo of the street lamp, one bulb at a time. She didn't notice the silence deepen. At 11:06 p.m., GPS from her phone shows her moving steadily along the sidewalk. At 11:07 p.m., she suddenly slows. At 11:08 p.m., the dot stops entirely right inside the stretch investigators would later call the blind zone. But at this moment, in the retelling, all she knows is that her shoelace has come loose. She crouches, fumbles with a knot, exhales a cloud of white breath. A dog barks somewhere far away, sharp, sudden, unsettling. She hesitates, glancing down the empty street. A second sound follows. Metal. Shifting. The faint scrape of something moving beneath the grate, only a few feet from her. She straightens slowly, unsure whether she imagined it. The fog seems to pulse around her, rearranging shapes that weren't there before. She steps backward, and then, nothing. No scream. No struggle reported by nearby residents. No frantic dash caught on audio. No sign that she ever left that sidewalk on her own. At 11:09 p.m., her phone screen lights up from an incoming message she never opens. At 11:10 p.m., the GPS location freezes permanently. By 11:12 p.m., her phone stops responding to pings entirely. When investigators later arrive, the sidewalk shows no scuff marks, no dropped items, no footprints, nothing but the quiet hum of water slipping through the storm system below. It is as if the night itself simply folded around her and erased her. And the final detail investigators would soon uncover was the most chilling of all. The place where the GPS signal died was directly beside a rusted storm drain, whose metal grate, unknown to everyone at the time, had been loose for months. The morning after she vanished began with a kind of silence that didn't make sense. Her roommate, Jenna, noticed first. By 8:30 a.m., the bed was still perfectly made, untouched. Her backpack wasn't in the room. Her shoes weren't by the door. At first, Jenna assumed she had gone to class early until she noticed the one thing her friend never forgot. Her charger was still plugged in beside the desk. A pit formed in Jenna's stomach. She texted. She called. Nothing. By noon, Maya was knocking on the RA's door, voice cracking as she said the words that always feel too dramatic until they aren't. She didn't come home last night. Campus security made the first calls, but by late afternoon, her parents had already boarded a flight, desperate voices echoing through the terminal as they pushed past TSA. Her mother kept whispering. She would have called. She always calls. Police began their official missing person protocol with forced calmness, taking statements from friends seated around a small table in the campus security office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. What was her mood when you last saw her? Did she argue with anyone? Any reason she might have left on her own? The questions felt wrong, cold, bureaucratic. Maya slammed her hand against the table. She didn't run away. Look at her stuff. She didn't pack anything. She didn't take anything. An officer scribbled a note but didn't react. By evening, search parties formed, students, neighbors, and volunteers, armed with flashlights and printed maps. They retraced every step from the study group house down Brookline Street. The fog had lifted, but the cold had deepened, and the street felt even more desolate than it had the night before. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Their claws clicked on the pavement as handlers led them along the sidewalk. The dogs paused near the blind zone, sniffing aggressively, but then pulled away, confused, picking up nothing solid. Not a trail, not a direction. People don't just disappear, her father muttered, gripping the missing posters until the edges crumpled in his fist. Somebody saw something. Somebody heard something. But if they had, no one came forward. CCTV footage became the next major lead. Detectives gathered in a dark room surrounded by monitors, scrubbing through hours of grainy nighttime recordings. One screen showed her walking under the yellow glow of a street lamp. Another captured a passing car. Another showed an empty sidewalk. Then the chilling detail emerged. She appears on camera 12 at 11:06 p.m. But camera 13, positioned just 80 yards down the same road, never records her passing. She should be here, an officer said, tapping the screen, brow furrowed. There's no side street, no alley. She had to walk past this camera. But she didn't. The lead detective replied quietly. The room went still. It meant only one thing. Whatever happened to her happened in the narrow gap between those two cameras. For the first time, the investigation shifted from a missing person search to a suspected abduction or worse. Back outside, her parents walked Brookline Street alone after midnight. Her mother ran her hand along the cold metal of the nearest street sign, as if touching the world her daughter last touched would somehow pull her closer. The wind rustled the branches above. The drains murmured with hidden water beneath their feet. The whole street seemed to keep its secrets. Jenna stood at the end of the block, hugging herself, whispering, "She was right here. How can someone be right here, and then be nowhere?" The chapter closes on the detectives returning to the scene the next morning, staring down at the stretch of sidewalk between cameras 12 and 13, the blind zone, as one of them muttered, "This is where she vanished. So this is where we start over." The stretch of sidewalk between cameras 12 and 13 looked ordinary at first glance, just a narrow corridor of pavement lined with aging sycamores and rusting storm drains. But when detectives stood there in the early dawn light, it felt different, heavier, as if the air itself remembered something the rest of the world didn't. Detective Harrow knelt beside the curb, running his flashlight along the metal grate embedded in the concrete. The beam revealed flecks of rust, chipped paint, and something that made him pause. A faint scrape along the inside edge, fresh, sharp, unnatural. "This grate's been tampered with," he muttered. Another detective approached. "You think she went down there?" Harrow didn't answer. Instead, He pulled on gloves and tried lifting the grate. It shifted just slightly, but enough to confirm what would become the most disturbing revelation of the early investigation. The grate was not secured. It hadn't been for months. 8 feet below, a narrow vertical shaft fed into the city's sprawling storm system tunnels, large enough for an adult to stand in, if they didn't mind the constant drip of groundwater and the claustrophobic hum of moving water. But they found no signs she'd fallen. No torn fabric. No blood. No disturbed soil. And yet, the possibility lingered. The shaft yawned beneath them like a throat. Residents along Brookline Street were interviewed next. Most remembered nothing unusual, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Carter, recalled waking around 11 that night. "I heard something," she whispered, staring at her hands. "A thud, and then water splashing. But I thought maybe it was just the sewer backing up again." Another neighbor claimed he heard what sounded like a muffled cry, though he admitted he'd convinced himself it came from a raccoon. Red herrings began forming quickly. One maintenance worker assigned to this district stumbled through his alibi, hesitated, adjusted his story, claimed he'd never touched that grate, then later said he might have inspected it weeks before. Detectives leaned in hard. "Why the inconsistency?" Harrow asked. I don't know," the worker stammered. "There are dozens of grates. I can't keep track. I didn't do anything." Maybe he was telling the truth, maybe not. But the uncertainty only deepened the sense that the blind zone held its own logic, one built on shadows, echoes, and the hollow spaces beneath the city. With pressure mounting, investigators launched a full-scale search of the storm system. Teams in waterproof suits climbed into manholes and tunnels, dragging heavy lights behind them. The smell of algae and stagnant runoff clung to the air. Every footstep echoed unnaturally. It felt like descending into a different world, one where sunlight, people, and hope didn't exist. Hours below ground yielded nothing. No personal belongings. No physical evidence. Not even a footprint in the silt. "She isn't down here," one officer said, frustrated. But Harrow wasn't convinced. "Parts of this system are miles long. She could be anywhere." Yet even he sensed they were missing something important, something hiding in plain sight. Then, 3 weeks after the disappearance, it happened. Her phone, which had been dark and unresponsive since the night she vanished, suddenly pinged a location. Not above ground. Not from a tower in another state. Not from a stolen handset sold off by a kid on the street. The signal came from underground. From the storm system. From somewhere near the blind zone. Detectives stared at the coordinates in disbelief. "That's impossible," one whispered. "Phones don't just turn on after weeks. Batteries don't resurrect themselves." But the data was real. Brief. A single, flickering ping. And then, silence again. The officers exchanged looks: fear, confusion, disbelief, blending into something darker. If the phone had been underground all along, how deep had she gone? And more importantly, had she been alive long enough to move it? As the chapter ends, Harrow stands again at the edge of the blind zone, staring down into the darkness beneath the loose grate, whispering the question none of them could shake. How far did she fall? And who, if anyone, was down there with her? The seasons changed, but the street where she vanished remained frozen in time. For the first few weeks after her disappearance, Brookline Street buzzed with search parties, flashing lights, and volunteers calling her name into the cold November air. But as winter arrived and search efforts dwindled, the street returned to its quiet stillness, its normalcy, feeling almost offensive. Her parents refused to let the case fade. They moved into a small rental near campus, turning the living room into a command center. Stacks of maps, printouts, timelines, and hand-drawn diagrams were pinned across the walls. Every morning her father stood before them, searching for the thread he hoped would finally pull everything together. Her mother attended every vigil, every community meeting, her voice hoarse from repeating the same plea. "Please don't stop looking. Someone knows something." But as weeks turned into months, fewer people showed up. Posters faded in the rain. Students graduated. New freshmen arrived who had never even heard her name. Detectives cycled through theories, none satisfying. Abduction, accident, voluntary disappearance? Each seemed to collapse under scrutiny. The phone ping from underground remained the strangest clue, an anomaly explained away by technical error because the alternative was too unsettling. Detective Harrow, however, couldn't let it go. He visited the blind zone repeatedly, standing for long minutes beside the loose grate until the cold stiffened his joints. Something had happened here, something that didn't fit the patterns of ordinary cases. By spring, the case was cold. Officially suspended, unofficially haunting. Her parents pressed forward with private investigators. They distributed flyers across 3 counties. They chased down rumors, sightings, and dubious tips from people claiming to have seen someone who looked like her. Every lead ended the same way. Nowhere. Summer felt longer than usual, heavy with the kind of heat that amplifies exhaustion. Her father sat on a bench overlooking the storm drain one evening, the cicadas screeching in the trees overhead, and whispered, "If you're down there, give us something. Anything." But the tunnel only breathed out its usual damp chill. Fall returned like a cruel anniversary. The campus held a memorial on the 1-year mark. Candles flickered in paper cups. Students who'd barely known her stood silently among those who loved her. Her mother pressed a trembling hand to a photograph of her daughter smiling, bright-eyed, alive, and whispered, "I'm not giving up." Detective Harrow attended the vigil from the edge of the crowd. He caught fragments of conversations, regret, anger, frustration, and beneath it all, the persistent echo of one repeated question. How does a person vanish on a well-lit street with no witnesses? Winter loomed again when the city announced a major infrastructure overhaul. Several storm tunnels, including the one near Brookline Street, needed deep maintenance for the first time in over a decade. Crews would be clearing debris, reinforcing walls, removing blockages. Harrow felt a chill when he read the notice. Not hope, not closure. Something else, an instinct honed from years of cases that refused to stay buried. He visited her parents that weekend, sat across from them at the cluttered table, chose his words carefully. "They're opening the tunnels this month," he said quietly. "Places we never reached." Her mother closed her eyes. Her father exhaled, leaning back in his chair as if absorbing the impact of a blow. "Do you think?" Her mother whispered, fear and hope braided into a single breath. "They'll find something." Harrow's voice dropped to almost nothing. "I think it's the first real chance we've had in a long time." Snow began to fall outside, soft and silent, settling over Brookline Street like a shroud. None of them knew it yet, but beneath that street, deep in the darkness where the city rarely looked, something waited, something that had been hidden for a year, caught in the slow, cold current of the storm system. And soon, the tunnels would give it back. The sewer crew entered the storm tunnel just after sunrise, bundled in reflective gear, their boots splashing through shallow water as they descended the metal ladder one by one. The morning was bitterly cold, breath hanging in the air like pale smoke. None of them were thinking about the missing college student. Maintenance work had nothing to do with cold cases. Not until that day. The tunnel beneath Brookline Street felt like stepping into another world, dark, echoing, smelling of wet concrete and old runoff. Water dripped rhythmically from overhead joints, creating a slow, steady beat that amplified through the narrow passage. Their headlamps carved thin cones of light through the darkness. "Feels tighter than last year," one worker muttered. "That's because half of this hasn't been cleared in a decade," another replied, shifting his flashlight across the curved tunnel walls. "We need to check for blockages all the way to the reinforcement point." They walked deeper, boots sloshing through the cold water until they reached a junction where debris often caught. It was here the lead worker noticed something wedged above the waterline, caught on a jutting piece of concrete. "Hold up," he said sharply. The others gathered around as he climbed onto a narrow ledge and reached toward the object. At first glance, it looked like a clump of fabric and mud. But as he brushed away the grime, a hard plastic surface gleamed faintly beneath the dirt. His breath stalled. He wiped again slowly, carefully, until the letters came through. A name. A photo, water-warped but unmistakable. A student ID card. The tunnel went silent except for the dripping water. "You're joking," someone whispered. That's her, isn't it? The missing girl?" The lead worker didn't answer. His hands trembled slightly as he held the card up to his flashlight. The edges were worn, the laminate peeling, but the image remained a frozen moment of youth and certainty that no longer existed above ground. "We call this in," he said, voice tight. "Right now." While one worker radioed the supervisor, another noticed something else tangled beside the ID. A torn scrap of fabric, dark, thin, faded from months of exposure. He lifted it gently, recognizing the texture immediately. "Clothing," he murmured. "Women's clothing." By the time police arrived, the crew had cordoned off the immediate area. Detective Harrow descended the ladder himself, jaw set, breath unsteady. When he stepped onto the tunnel floor, the air hit him like a cold wave, thick, stale, metallic. "What have you got?" he asked. The lead worker handed him the mud-caked ID and the scrap of fabric without a word. Harrow stared at them in his gloved hands. He had imagined this moment 100 times, but imagining it and touching the evidence were two different worlds. "This was lodged up there," the worker said, pointing to the ledge. "Not floating, stuck." Harrow climbed up, shining his light along the wall. That's when he saw them, faint vertical streaks in the grime, irregular but unmistakable. Scratches, claw marks, as if someone had tried to climb. His throat tightened. "We need forensic imaging down here immediately," he said, stepping back onto the tunnel floor. "And I want mapping done for how debris would travel through this section." But even as he spoke, a darker realization began to settle. The ledge where the ID was found was hundreds of feet from the nearest access point. The water in this part of the system didn't flow fast enough to push objects this far, not without help from something. Or someone. A worker broke the silence. "Detective, if she fell in, how did her things get all the way down here?" Harrow didn't answer. He walked to the center of the tunnel, listening to the water, trying to imagine the girl navigating this darkness. Alone, injured, terrified. He turned his light down the long stretch of tunnel, extending into pitch-black nothingness. Every instinct he had screamed the same thought. She didn't end up here by accident. The chapter closes on Harrow, pressing his hand to the cold tunnel wall, whispering to himself in a voice barely audible over the dripping water. She moved through here. Or she was moved. And whichever it was, this isn't where it ends. Detective Harrow stood at the mouth of the tunnel days after the discovery, staring into the looming dark. The ID, the torn fabric, the scratches on the wall, they had shifted the investigation from a cold case into something far stranger, something that demanded reconstruction, not speculation. Beneath the city, where light rarely reached and sound warped into hollow echoes, an entirely different story had unfolded. Inside the precinct conference room, investigators crowded around a large map of the storm system. Lines and arrows traced pathways beneath Brookline Street, the blind zone, and the deeper tunnels where the worker found her belongings. The network looked less like infrastructure and more like a labyrinth. Narrow tunnels, dead ends, angled drops, and cross-sections that twisted unpredictably. Harrow tapped the spot where her phone last pinged. "This is where she stopped," he said, "and this location," he pointed to where the ID was found, "is roughly 400 feet downstream." One detective frowned. "Runoff here is minimal. Water flow isn't strong enough to drag debris that far, especially something as heavy as an ID card lodged in mud." "So someone moved it?" another asked. "Or she did," Harrow replied quietly. The room fell silent at the implication. Her parents were brought in later that afternoon. They sat side by side, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles blanched white. The discovery had drained them, shock, grief, hope, and terror fusing into a single trembling breath. Harrow spoke gently. "We've reanalyzed the tunnel system. We believe it's possible your daughter survived the initial fall." Her mother looked up sharply. "Survived? You think she was alive? Down there?" "There are indications she attempted to climb," Harrow said, sliding photographs of the scratch marks toward them. The lines etched into the wall told a story no one had been prepared to hear: desperate, vertical, human. These marks were made intentionally. Her father swallowed hard, voice cracking. "How long could someone live in a place like that?" Harrow hesitated. "Hours, maybe longer. It depends on injuries, water levels, and whether she found a pocket with enough airflow. The silence that followed was unbearable, but the mystery only deepened. A forensic engineer stepped into the conversation with a grim expression. There's something else. The ID was found in a section that requires navigating a narrow turn too tight for debris to pass without manual handling. It couldn't have simply washed there. So she walked? Her mother whispered. Possibly. The word hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. If she walked, then she had been conscious. Injured, yes, but aware, fighting, trying to survive in a dark, twisting maze beneath the city. But there's a problem, the engineer continued. From her last known position, she would have had to choose between two tunnel directions. One leads back toward daylight. The other leads deeper. He pointed to the second path, the path where her belongings had been found. She ended up in the deeper route. Her father leaned forward. You're saying she went the wrong way? Maybe, Harrow answered. Or, maybe she wasn't alone. The room stilled. For a year, the investigation had avoided darker possibilities. Abduction, coercion, someone using the tunnels deliberately. But now, the conversation could no longer sidestep it. There are signs, Harrow continued carefully, that someone familiar with this system may have been using it. We found boot impressions in a dry section from months ago. Not hers, not maintenance crews. Someone else. The weight of that revelation pressed on everyone. Her mother whispered. So what really happened to her down there? Harrow looked at the map again. The paths, the dead ends, the scratches. The ID placed far too deliberately to be accidental. We may never know the full story, he said softly. But she tried to get out. That much is clear, and something or someone led her deeper instead. Outside, the winter wind hissed against the windows, a cold reminder of the street where she vanished. Beneath that street, the tunnels remained as they had always been, dark, indifferent, ancient. But they had given back just enough to reveal one truth. She hadn't disappeared into nothing. She had gone somewhere, and someone had likely known exactly how to follow her. The chapter closes on Harrow walking alone toward Brookline Street, stopping above the blind zone, staring down at the grate, its rusted surface now bolted shut, and whispering. She didn't fall through the cracks, she was taken by them.